For nearly 3 decades, John Ramsay answered questions about his daughter's murder in careful, lawyer-approved sentences. Short, controlled, guarded. But in the past year, something changed. He sat for extended, unscripted interviews. He met face-to-face with police leadership. He publicly petitioned the President of the United States. And in one particularly striking moment, he said something he had never said quite so plainly before. "We have the killer's DNA. The police just need to use it." That is not a throwaway line. That is a man in his 80s, after 30 years of silence, guardedness, and grief, finally saying out loud what he actually believes and naming exactly what he thinks is standing between his family and the truth. This is the story of what John Ramsay has actually said, recently, in his own words, about his daughter JonBenét's unsolved murder, and what the evidence itself tells us about the person who has never been identified. Not tabloid speculation, not internet theory. This is built from verified interviews, official statements, documented biography, and confirmed forensic evidence, examined honestly. Without accusing anyone, the facts don't support. Before we get into it, if you want true crime coverage that actually separates fact from rumor, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next in this case. This story has generated more unverified claims than almost any murder in modern history, and it deserves better than that. If you're here for the real story, hit that like button right now, and tell me in the comments what you think John Ramsay's recent statements actually reveal. Now let's get into exactly what he's been saying, and why now. To understand why John Ramsay's recent words carry the weight they do, you first need to understand who this man actually is, beyond the headlines. JonBenét's Ramsay was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, the son of Mary Jane and James Dudley Ramsay, a decorated World War II pilot. He attended Michigan State University, earning a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering in 1966, later returning to complete an MBA in 1971. He served as an officer in the United States Navy's Civil Engineer Corps, spending 3 years stationed in the Philippines and 8 more in a reserve unit in Atlanta. He became a licensed pilot and eventually owned 2 private planes. His personal life was shaped by loss well before December of 1996. He married his first wife, Lucinda Pash, in 1966, and together they had 3 children, Elizabeth, Melinda, and John Andrew. That marriage ended in divorce in 1978. In 1992, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was killed in a car accident at the age of 22, a loss that people close to him have described as one that permanently marked him. In 1980, he married Patsy, a former beauty pageant competitor, and together they had 2 more children, Burke, born in 1987, and JonBenet, born on August 6, 1990. Professionally, Ramsay built genuine, substantial success. In 1989, he founded Advanced Product Group, which merged with 2 other companies to become Access Graphics, a computer services firm. As president and CEO, he led that company into becoming a billion-dollar subsidiary of a major aerospace and defense contractor by 1991. By 1996, the Boulder Chamber of Commerce had named him Entrepreneur of the Year. That success gave his family a comfortable, stable life in Boulder, Colorado, including a year-end bonus of $118,000 in the weeks before Christmas, a figure that would go on to become one of the strangest and most closely examined details in the entire case that followed. For most of the 2 decades after JonBenét's death, that's largely where public knowledge of John Ramsay stopped. He gave a handful of major interviews. He wrote a memoir in 2012, focused less on the murder itself and more on the broader experience of surviving repeated grief and public suspicion. He largely withdrew from cameras, rebuilding a quiet life, first in Las Vegas, then in a second marriage in 2011 to John Russo, a fashion designer, away from the spotlight that had once made him one of the most recognized faces in American news. That began changing, gradually and then quite suddenly, starting in 2022. That year, he launched a public petition, ultimately gathering more than 16,000 signatures, calling on Colorado officials to allow independent DNA testing on evidence from his daughter's case. He told reporters at the time he was prepared to pursue legal action if the request went unanswered. It was a notably more assertive posture than the John Ramsay the public had grown used to seeing, a man choosing public confrontation over quiet, private waiting after decades of the opposite approach. Then, in January of 2025, came a moment he would later describe as genuinely significant. He met personally with Boulder's newly appointed police chief, Stephen Redfern. Afterward, he told reporters the meeting felt sincere, open, and more encouraging than conversations he'd had with the department in years. "I'm wildly encouraged by the fact that he's new, he's from the outside," Ramsay said. "He's not tainted by the culture that was there before." For a man who has spent decades expressing frustration with how Boulder investigators handled his daughter's case from the very first hours, that statement carries real weight. It suggests, for the first time in a long time, something resembling genuine trust in the people currently responsible for the investigation. He didn't stop there. Later that same year, Ramsay went further than he had in years, telling Denver reporters he believed 2025 could realistically be the year his daughter's case was finally solved. I sort of do, he said. The Boulder police appear to be working with the FBI now, and if they will do the DNA testing and use the genealogy research tool, I think there's better than a 50-50 chance we can identify the killer. A 50-50 chance is not a certainty, and Ramsay has never claimed otherwise, but it's a specific, calculated, publicly stated estimate from a man who has spent nearly 30 years living inside the details of this case more closely than almost anyone else on Earth, including, by his own account, professional investigators who have rotated in and out of the case file over the decades. To understand why he's placing so much weight on that specific number, and on genealogy testing specifically, you need to understand the piece of evidence he keeps returning to, again and again, in every interview he gives. In 1997, forensic testing identified DNA from an unknown male, found mixed with a small amount of blood in JonBenét's underwear. It did not match John Ramsay. It did not match his wife Patsy. It did not match their son Burke. It did not match any of the family friends who submitted samples during the investigation. When run against the FBI's National Criminal Database, it produced no match at all. In 2003, using newer touch DNA technology, capable of detecting genetic material from something as light as skin cell contact, that same unidentified profile turned up again, this time on a completely separate item, the long underwear JonBenet was wearing that night. Finding the same unknown male's genetic material in two different locations, on two different pieces of clothing she had on when she died, made an innocent incidental explanation, like factory contamination, significantly less statistically likely, according to the forensic experts who reviewed the findings at the time. In 2008, then District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal letter directly to John Ramsay, officially and publicly clearing the entire Ramsay family based on that DNA evidence. Her letter stated plainly that the match on two separate items made clear an unknown male had handled JonBenét's clothing, with no innocent explanation for its presence in two different locations. It remains one of the most notable formal exonerations in American criminal justice history. Some officials since have taken a more cautious position, noting that while the family isn't considered suspects, DNA alone hasn't been treated by every subsequent district attorney as a permanently case-closing conclusion. That tension between what the science strongly suggests and what institutions have been fully willing to declare has shadowed this case for nearly 2 decades. But the underlying evidence itself has never changed. There is DNA from an unidentified man on JonBenét's body and clothing, confirmed across multiple independent testing rounds, and to this day, in 2026, it has never been matched to anyone. Here's what John Ramsay has been saying about that specific fact, and it's worth hearing in his own words because it's more precise and more technical than most of what's been reported about this case over the years. Bottom line is we have the killer's DNA, and forensic genetic genealogy is the new tool which could give us the killer's name, if the police would only use it, he told reporters. He specifically pointed to the same method that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, more than 4 decades after that man's crimes, a technique that works by comparing crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases, gradually building outward through distant family connections until investigators can identify a likely candidate to investigate directly. It's worth taking a moment to actually explain how that process works because Ramsay's confidence in it is rooted in a fairly specific, well-documented scientific method, not vague hope. Forensic genetic genealogy doesn't require a suspect's own DNA to already exist in a criminal database. Instead, investigators upload a crime scene profile to public genealogy websites, the same kind of platforms millions of ordinary people use to trace their family ancestry. The software identifies genetic matches, distant cousins, sometimes third or fourth cousins the suspect has never even met, who happen to have voluntarily submitted their own DNA out of simple curiosity about their family history. From there, genealogists build outward, constructing family trees, cross-referencing birth records, geographic history, and age ranges, gradually narrowing an enormous pool of distant relatives down to a small handful of specific individuals who could plausibly be the source. It's slow, methodical work, sometimes taking months, but it's produced results in cases that were decades older and colder than JonBenét's. Ramsay has also been unusually specific about where he believes the obstacle actually lies, and it's a more nuanced position than simply blaming police inaction. He's stated publicly that he believes local and state agencies, including the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, likely don't have the specialized technology or personnel required to perform this exact type of advanced genetic analysis in-house. His argument isn't that no one cares. It's that the work needs to go to private specialized laboratories with proven track records solving similarly old cold cases, laboratories he's identified by name in interviews, and he's pushed, repeatedly and specifically, for that exact handoff to happen, rather than waiting for government labs to independently develop that same capability internally. In 2025, John Ramsay's oldest son added a detail to this picture that had never previously been made public, something the family had apparently known privately for some time but hadn't shared. According to what they've been told directly, the unidentified male DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing still hasn't actually been run through genealogical testing, because the existing sample hasn't yet been considered sensitive or complete enough for current technology to reliably generate a usable profile from it. It's not if, but when, is how the family has described the situation, framing it not as institutional refusal, but as a genuine technical limitation that continues to narrow as the underlying science improves year over year. That's a meaningfully different explanation than the one many assumed for years that police simply weren't trying. It suggests something more complicated, a technical bottleneck combined with institutional caution about deploying a still developing forensic method on a sample that may not yet be robust enough to produce reliable, court-defensible results. Whether that explanation fully accounts for nearly 3 decades of limited progress is something reasonable people, including members of Ramsay's own family, clearly still disagree about. But it's the explanation the family says they've actually been given directly, and it deserves to be reported as exactly that, rather than flattened into a simpler story of pure negligence. Then came the moment this past summer that pulled this case back into national headlines in a way few could have predicted. Yvonne Woods, a Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst who had worked at the agency since before JonBenét's death in 1996, pleaded guilty in June of 2026 to multiple felony charges: cybercrime, perjury, forgery, and attempting to influence a public servant, tied to mishandling DNA evidence across more than 1,000 separate cases spanning 18 years of her employment there. An internal review found she had omitted material facts, tampered with test results, and repeatedly violated laboratory policy. Misconduct first flagged by a concerned colleague as far back as 2014, though not formally investigated and fully acted upon until a data anomaly was independently discovered by lab management in 2023. Under her plea agreement, she faces a mandatory prison sentence of between 8 and 16 years. Because Woods had been employed at the CBI during the exact period JonBenét's case was originally being processed, the news immediately and understandably raised public questions about whether this specific high-profile investigation might have been affected by her documented misconduct. It's the kind of coincidence that, in a case already defined by institutional distrust, was never going to go unnoticed, and it briefly reignited exactly the kind of speculation this case has struggled with for 30 years. John Ramsay addressed this directly and, notably, calmly. Speaking to reporters, he said he had long understood that Woods had no involvement in his daughter's case, because the earliest and most critical DNA testing had actually been performed by an independent private laboratory in Virginia, not by the CBI at all. I believe an outside private lab did the first evidence testing and reported in January of 1997 that they found unidentified male DNA in JonBenét's underwear, he told Fox News Digital. Both the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office confirmed this publicly as well, stating that after a full review of the case's records, they found no evidence Woods had personally handled or affected the Ramsey case evidence. What's notable here isn't just that Ramsey was right about the technical detail, it's how he chose to respond to the scandal itself. Rather than treating it as validation of decades of institutional distrust, he used the moment to renew his specific, technical argument. He told News Nation that while he doesn't believe his daughter's case was directly impacted by Woods's misconduct, he still has ongoing concerns about how the broader investigation has been handled. We did know that a number of items from the crime scene were sent in for testing, and a number were not tested, he said. A detail that hadn't been widely reported before and that adds real specificity to his long-standing frustration. He reiterated once again that his family has been pushing for roughly a year for the case to move to forensic genetic genealogy testing specifically, calling it the tool that could actually resolve this, and describing the Colorado Bureau of Investigation as simply not currently equipped to perform that particular type of analysis themselves. Then, in September of 2025, Ramsey did something almost no one expected from a man who had spent most of his life carefully avoiding political entanglement. He publicly appealed directly to President Donald Trump, asking for federal attention and assistance in pushing his daughter's case toward resolution. It's an extraordinary step, one that reflects both genuine hope that outside pressure might finally move a stalled institutional process, and frankly, the accumulated exhaustion of a man who has now spent more years fighting for his daughter's justice than she ever lived to experience. This past December, Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern addressed the case publicly himself in a video statement marking another anniversary of JonBenét's death. "Techniques and technology constantly evolve," he said. "This is especially true with technology related to DNA testing." It's a carefully worded statement, one that neither promises a breakthrough nor dismisses the possibility of one. In a joint statement issued around the same time, officials went slightly further, acknowledging publicly that federal, state, and local agencies remain steadfast in their diligence to explore all advanced DNA testing capabilities from outside independent labs, while ensuring the efficacy and validation support for those evolving testing methodologies. According to people close to the investigation, this represents one of the clearest public acknowledgments yet that outside independent laboratory testing, the exact thing John Ramsey has been requesting for years, is genuinely being evaluated at an institutional level rather than simply being deferred indefinitely. So, what does all of this actually add up to when you step back and look at the complete current picture in 2026? It tells us that the man once treated by parts of the media as a suspect in his own daughter's murder has spent nearly 2 decades formally cleared by consistent, independently confirmed DNA evidence, and has spent the last several years transforming from someone who mostly avoided cameras into someone actively, specifically, and increasingly publicly pushing institutions toward a particular scientific solution he clearly deeply believes in. He's not vaguely demanding justice in the abstract anymore. He's naming specific technologies, specific laboratories, specific bureaucratic bottlenecks, and specific timelines. That's a notably different kind of public voice than the one most people associate with this case from decades past. It's worth being honest about what this recent surge of public statements does not tell us. It doesn't tell us who the unidentified male is. It doesn't tell us whether forensic genetic genealogy will actually succeed on this particular sample, even once fully applied, since the technique depends heavily on whether enough of a suspect's relatives have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to public genealogy databases, something that can't be predicted or controlled in advance. And it doesn't erase the genuinely difficult, still unresolved questions that have shadowed this case since 1996. Questions about the ransom note's origin, about the absence of forced entry into the home, questions that even John Ramsey himself has never claimed to have definitively answered. What his recent statements do tell us is where he believes the answer is most likely to come from. And it's a position built on his own close, decades-long study of the case file, not on wishful thinking. Let's talk, honestly and carefully, about what is actually known about the person whose DNA remains unidentified, because this is where responsible reporting has to be especially precise. The physical evidence establishes, with reasonable forensic confidence, that an unidentified male had contact with JonBenét's body and clothing around the time of her death. That is a documented, independently confirmed forensic fact, not speculation. What it does not establish is anything about that individual's identity, their relationship, if any, to the family, or their whereabouts that night beyond having apparently been present. Investigators have not named a suspect. No arrest has ever been made. No confession offered in the nearly 30 years since has ever meaningfully aligned with the established physical evidence. Responsible coverage of this case has to hold both of those things at once: the significance of the DNA evidence and the genuine limits of what it currently proves. It's also worth revisiting, briefly and honestly, why the family itself was ever under such intense suspicion in the first place. Because understanding that history is part of understanding why John Ramsay's current advocacy carries the emotional weight it does. In the earliest hours of the investigation, on the morning of December 26, 1996, the crime scene at the Ramsay home was compromised almost immediately. After Patsy Ramsay discovered a ransom note on the staircase and called 911 at 5:52 a.m., friends and family moved freely through the house before it was ever properly secured. A first responding officer glanced into the small basement room where JonBenét's body actually lay, but didn't step inside or turn on the light, delaying discovery for roughly 7 more hours. When John Ramsay did eventually find his daughter, during a second search of the house suggested by detectives around 1 in the afternoon, his instinctive reaction to pick her up and carry her upstairs further disturbed evidence that could never be recovered. None of these were acts of malice. They were the accumulated result of shock, grief, and an inexperienced local department suddenly facing a case far beyond anything it had previously handled. A college-town police force built for bicycle theft and minor disturbances, not a complex homicide investigation that would explode into a worldwide media event within days. But they meant that, from the very first day, this case was operating with a permanently compromised foundation, one that has made every subsequent piece of evidence, including the DNA, that much more important, because there's so little else left that hasn't been touched by that early chaos. The ransom note itself remains one of the strangest, least resolved elements of the entire case, and it's worth understanding why it still matters so directly to the current push for DNA testing. Nearly 3 pages long, written using paper and a pen found inside the home, it demanded $118,000, an oddly specific figure that closely matched a bonus John Ramsay had recently received from his employer, a detail that was not public knowledge at the time. Handwriting analysts spent years examining it, comparing it against samples from Patsy Ramsay and others with access to the home. The results were never conclusive. No expert has ever definitively identified who wrote it. That note remains, to this day, one of the central reasons this case has never fit neatly into any single, simple theory, and it's part of why John Ramsay himself has stated, repeatedly, that he doesn't believe DNA evidence alone will answer every question this case has raised. He said more than once that identifying the source of that unknown DNA would be the beginning of real answers, not necessarily the end of every open question. There's a broader context worth understanding here too, because John Ramsay's advocacy hasn't existed in a vacuum, and it hasn't been purely reactive. Over the years, independent investigators who reviewed the case in depth, including experienced homicide detectives and criminal profilers brought in specifically to examine the evidence with fresh eyes, have publicly stated their own professional conclusions that the totality of the evidence points toward an outside perpetrator rather than anyone within the household. These are informed, professional assessments based on independent review of the case file, not proven legal fact, since no trial connected to this case has ever taken place, and it's important to present them exactly as that. But they've given Ramsay's public advocacy something it might otherwise lack: a degree of outside professional credibility that isn't solely dependent on the public simply trusting a grieving father's own account of events. It's also worth being honest that not every claim ever raised about this case, or about John Ramsay personally, has held up under scrutiny. Over the decades, various theories have circulated online and in less rigorous documentaries, including uncorroborated allegations originating from unverified sources, some describing themselves as former intelligence professionals, proposing elaborate, specific scenarios implicating Ramsay directly in a coordinated family cover-up. None of these theories has ever been supported by physical evidence. None has ever been presented in any court proceeding. None has ever been endorsed by any law enforcement agency involved in this case. And all of them are directly contradicted by the DNA evidence itself, which has never matched John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsay. Responsible reporting doesn't repeat unverified accusations as though they carry the same weight as established, forensically confirmed fact. And it's worth stating plainly here that no physical evidence has ever linked John Ramsay to his daughter's death, while the strongest, most consistently confirmed physical evidence in this case has always pointed elsewhere. John Ramsay's advocacy has also had a documented, tangible impact beyond just his own daughter's case. His public pressure for legislative reform contributed directly to Colorado's 2013 cold case review law, giving other families of unsolved homicide victims a formal legal path to demand fresh investigation into cases that had gone quiet, something that didn't exist in Colorado before his advocacy work. He's also worked privately, largely without media attention, with organizations supporting other families of unsolved homicide victims, sharing his own decades of experience navigating legal obstacles and public judgment. Whatever remains genuinely unresolved about JonBenét's own case, the documented institutional failures that shaped its earliest hours have, over the following decades, measurably influenced how other departments across the country now handle crime scene security, evidence preservation, and interagency DNA testing protocols, changes now reflected in national guidelines from organizations like the National Institute of Justice. That's a legacy that exists independently of whether this particular case is ever formally solved, and it's one Ramsay himself has referenced when discussing why he continues pushing publicly, even now, even at 82 years old, even after burying nearly everyone else he loved along the way. Because that's really the emotional core underneath all of this recent, more assertive public advocacy, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than skipping past. John Ramsay has lost his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, in a car accident in 1992. He lost JonBenét's in 1996. He lost his wife Patsy to ovarian cancer in 2006, 2 years before the DNA exoneration letter even arrived, meaning she never lived to see her name formally and publicly cleared by the very evidence her husband had spent years fighting to have properly analyzed. Patsy spent the final years of her life, still widely suspected by a significant portion of the public, despite never being charged with any crime, and she died without ever seeing that suspicion formally lifted. He has spent nearly 3 decades watching his surviving son, Burke, defend himself against theories built more on speculation and documentary sensationalism than on any actual forensic evidence connecting him to his sister's death. Burke, who was 9 years old the night his sister died, gave his first public interview in 2016, describing waking to chaos in the house and learning his sister was dead. Weeks later, a major network documentary suggested he might have been involved, a theory Burke's DNA directly contradicts. He ultimately sued the network for $750 million in defamation, a case settled under undisclosed terms in 2019, after which he largely retreated from public life entirely, working quietly in information technology and avoiding media almost completely ever since. He's now in his late 30s, having spent essentially his entire adult life carrying a weight he has never been forensically connected to. Against that backdrop of accumulated, repeated loss, John Ramsay's decision, over just the past 2 years, to become dramatically more public, more specific, and more assertive isn't really a change in character so much as a change in urgency. He is 82 years old. He has said, plainly and repeatedly, that his one remaining singular goal is simply to know who did this before he dies. That's not a vague, generic plea for justice anymore. It's become, in his own recent words, a specific, technical, deeply researched argument about forensic genetic genealogy, laboratory capabilities, and institutional bottlenecks. delivered by a man who has clearly spent years studying exactly how similar cases around the country have actually been solved, and who is now trying, with whatever time and public platform he has left, to apply those same specific lessons to his own daughter's case. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge just how unusual this kind of sustained, technically literate advocacy actually is for someone in his position. Most families of murder victims, understandably, don't have the resources, the platform, or, frankly, the decades of accumulated familiarity with forensic science that John Ramsay has developed over the course of this case. He's met with DNA experts. He's studied how the Golden State Killer case actually unfolded. He's learned the specific vocabulary of forensic genetic genealogy, the difference between a partial profile and a usable one, the reasons a sample might be too degraded for certain testing methods but not others. That level of technical fluency doesn't happen by accident. It's the product of someone who has spent nearly 30 years refusing to simply accept "we're still investigating" as a sufficient answer, and who has instead tried to understand, in real detail, exactly what would actually need to happen for his daughter's case to move forward. So where does that actually leave things today in 2026? The Boulder Police Department continues to describe the investigation as an active, ongoing departmental priority, with officials stating publicly that they continue to review evidence and closely monitor advances in DNA testing technology. Federal, state, and local agencies have acknowledged, more directly than in years past, that they're evaluating outside independent laboratory testing specifically. But no arrest has been made. No individual has been formally named as a suspect. The unidentified male DNA recovered in 1997 and independently reconfirmed in 2003 still has not been run through the specific forensic genetic genealogy process that has already helped solve dozens of similarly old cold cases across the country, some considerably older than this one. What has genuinely changed, and what makes this particular moment in the case's long history worth paying close attention to, is the voice of the one person who has been closest to every single detail of this investigation for nearly 30 years, and who has, for most of that time, chosen to speak carefully, sparingly, and defensively. That voice sounds different now. It's more specific. It's more technical. It's more publicly confident, even as it remains carefully honest about what it doesn't yet know. When John Ramsay says, plainly, "We have the killer's DNA," he's not making an accusation against any specific person. He's stating, based on nearly 3 decades of forensic evidence that has never wavered across multiple independent testing rounds, that the physical proof of another person's presence already exists, sitting preserved, waiting for the specific scientific process that has already worked in case after case just like this one, somewhere else in the country. JonBenét's Ramsay would be 36 years old this year. Her father, now well into his 80s, has outlived his wife, 2 of his daughters, and decades of public suspicion that the physical evidence has never actually supported. What he hasn't outlived is the wait for an answer. And for the first time in a very long time, based on everything he said publicly over the past year, he sounds like a man who genuinely believes that wait might finally, actually be nearing its end, not because the mystery has suddenly become simpler, but because the specific scientific tool capable of solving it has finally, possibly, become available to use. If this story affected you the way it's clearly affected millions of people over nearly 30 years, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you catch our continued coverage as this case keeps developing. Hit that like button if you believe cases like this one deserve real, evidence-based answers instead of decades of speculation. And I want to hear from you directly in the comments. After hearing John Ramsay's own recent specific words about forensic genetic genealogy and where he believes the real bottleneck has been, has your understanding of this case shifted at all? Do you think 2026 could actually be the year this finally gets resolved? Remember, underneath every headline, every documentary, and every theory this case has generated over the last 30 years, there is a real family that has lived through unimaginable repeated loss and unimaginable sustained public scrutiny, largely in the absence of the kind of definitive evidence that would normally justify it. JonBenét's Ramsay was a real 6-year-old girl whose life was taken far too soon, inside her own home, during what should have been one of the safest, happiest weeks of the year. Her father has spent nearly 30 years refusing to stop asking who did it, and for the first time in a long time, he's saying, publicly and specifically, exactly what he thinks it will finally take to get an answer. The DNA already exists. The technology to potentially use it exists. The only remaining question, the one John Ramsay himself is now asking louder than he has in decades, is whether it will actually, finally be used.